just like the oceans. The oceans are just big pools of Pinot Noir that just stay there. They stay there forever. So the Earth is flat. Okay, so I need an example of a claim. The Earth is flat. That's something that a lot of people think is true, or a surprisingly large number of people think is true. And then we need an argument for that claim, right? So imagine that you're at a cocktail party and you've got your plate of hors d'oeuvres and your wine, and you're standing there and a flat earther pins you down in the corner and tries to convince you that the Earth is flat. What might that person say to try to convince you? We don't need an argument with a whole bunch of steps. We just need some considerations that might convince you. Here's what they could do. They could take all the cheese off your plate, right? And they could take your wine and pour it on the plate and show you what happens. What happens when the wine gets poured onto your plate? Well, it just kind of like moves around a little bit. It settles. Maybe some parts of the plate are a little lower than others, and it moves, and then it all just settles in the lowest place and just stays there. That's what happens with the plate. Here, the water just kind of like puddles on it. There, that's the water, right? And then they say, well, what happens when you draw some water or some wine onto a basketball? Well, the water just drips right off. And then think about what happens when water is poured on the Earth. When the rain clouds rain down all that Pinot Noir or water or whatever liquid is coming from the sky, what happens? Well, it does exactly this. It just sort of puddles on the ground, right? And so the flat earther will claim, the Earth must be flat. If the Earth were a sphere, then the water would just run off the Earth. But it doesn't run off the Earth. The water puddles exactly like it does as if the Earth were a plate. It moves around a little bit in some rivers and streams because the plate isn't perfectly flat, right? And it moves to the lowest points and it stays there, just like the oceans. The oceans are just big pools of Pinot Noir that just stay there. They stay there forever. So the Earth is flat. That's the argument, right? And you know what? Let's just write out the argument. I'm going to write it out. It's something like this. Therefore, these are like three little dots that philosophers and logicians sometimes use to mean therefore. What's wrong with this argument? It's not good. It doesn't work, this argument. What's wrong with it is that, well, basketballs are relevantly different from the Earth, right? I mean, if you had a basketball just floating out there in space, all by itself, near nothing else, what would happen if you poured some wine on it? Well, the wine would stick to the basketball. It would pool in the little crevices, the little grip lines in the basketball in here. The water would sort of pool in there, and the water would stick to the basketball because the water is attracted to the basketball because of gravity, right? The molecules of the water and the molecules of the basketball are attracted to one another, right? So actually, if there was a basketball all by itself in space, the water would stick to the basketball. It wouldn't run off. But if you put that basketball next to a way bigger object, then the water on the basketball would be also attracted to that way bigger object. In fact, it would be way more attracted to that larger object. So the basketball would, you have this huge, huge, huge object next to the basketball. The water would hit the basketball, and instead of pooling, it would just peace out and cling to the larger object. Well, that's what happens when a basketball is on Earth, because every basketball in the universe is right next to a very large object, the Earth. And so that's why the water runs off the basketball. It's because the basketball is right next to a much larger object. If the Earth was right next to a much larger object, like if you took Jupiter, say this is now the Earth, and you took Jupiter and you smacked it right next to the planet Earth, and then you poured some water onto the planet Earth, what would the water do? It would do the same thing. It would just leave the Earth immediately and get sucked onto Jupiter because Jupiter is way bigger, has way more gravity, and it would attract all the water, right? And then, of course, it would attract the air in the atmosphere around the Earth. That would all go to Jupiter, too. And then the Earth itself would get sucked into Jupiter, and it would clang into the surface of Jupiter. Jupiter doesn't really have a surface, I think. It's like, all gaseous and whatever. But it would fall into Jupiter. And that's what happens with the basketballs. The water dribbles off, gets attracted to the big object, the Earth. And then if you let go of the basketball, well, the basketball is attracted to that bigger object. It falls to the ground. That's what happens with basketballs. Here's the problem with this argument. The problem is that premise 1 is false. If the Earth were spherical, then the water would run off is not true. That feature, the water running off, that is only a feature of spheres that are right next to much larger objects. So that's the case for basketballs, but the relevant difference between a basketball and the planet Earth is not right next to some other object. Okay, so this argument is garbage. It's a garbage argument. It's no good, right? It doesn't show that this conclusion is true. But just because we reject this argument, this garbage argument, just because we reject this argument, it doesn't mean that the Earth is spherical, that the Earth is not flat. The conclusion could still be true. It's not. It's not true. The Earth is roughly a sphere, and this claim is false. And the flat earthers are just wrong. But the fact that we've undermined this argument doesn't show that the flat earthers are wrong. It could be that this argument's no good, but that there's some other argument that gets us to this conclusion. Or, for that matter, it could be that there's no argument out there that gets us to this conclusion, but this conclusion is still true, right? Just because something is true, it doesn't mean that there has to be some argument that's available that demonstrates that it's true. The point is this. There's a difference between a claim, and an argument in favor of that claim. And just because you undermine or reject an argument in favor of a claim doesn't mean that you have undermined the claim itself. You've just undermined one way of getting to that claim, or one way of showing that that claim is true. Even without that way of showing that the claim is true, the claim could still be true. Except not this one. This one, it turns out, is false.